The variety of Star Wars stories and mediums is massive, but is this the reason the last few projects really haven't landed? And what could they do to make things right? Welcome to Star Wars Uplink, your place for everything Star Wars gaming, the TV shows, and the movies. Let's jump in.
Just you reconsider playing that message for him.
Star Wars back in the day had Legends, of course, this wide-reaching Star Wars network of stories and other storytellers within the Star Wars universe that could do something interesting that could or could not tie into the movies. They had great successes and also some big failures when we look at the wide variety of stories that were told. But when it came down to it, the original trilogy of movies opened up and basically from the beginning had continuations of the story, rewrites of the story through books and comics. But when it came down to it, the prequels and George Lucas, he didn't really care when it came to, I needed to do this because that one author did this thing. And I think many of the prequel movies rendered entire series obsolete. It basically made them legends. But I want to ask the question.
Yeah.
Is this a good direction for Star Wars to take now? And what really needs to happen for Star Wars to thrive? Because if you look at the Clone Wars had incredible storytelling in them. They had amazing moments with characters that we knew and loved, and continuing stories that with characters that we knew and loved.
Yeah.
And it really fleshed out what the story of Star Wars was. I do wonder though, is the expectation that we don't need to tell this in this story because it's already fleshed out in this other piece of media, or we are not going to add this in there because there's going to be a story later that added this or that will add this in there? Is this the thing that's really making Star Wars struggle? I personally would think so. I think this focus on lore over story is going to be the end of Star Wars as we know it, and it's going to change things in a way I don't think is going to be good for the franchise. I think they may go into this direction quite deeply, but at some point they're going to have to make a correction back to this idea that story is king.
Oh, it's a tricky topic. There's this beauty to what they did in the books and in Legends, because I think George Lucas also thought of all these other books that were written afterwards as kind of just fan fiction.
I think he's quoted as saying it is fan fiction.
Yeah, so he's like, doesn't matter. This is my story. I'm going to tell it how I need to tell it because I've got the plan, sort of thing. But that's also kind of the idea of what these authors did as well. Yeah. It's like they went in and they said, hey, it could be like this, so I'm going to write it like this.
Yeah.
And it's all so good. It's like when it's a good story, when it's good, cool, I don't know. There's lots of good things about fan fiction and what you do with it and all that. But when you're trying to make it all work,
that's the real complicated part of Star Wars right now, because they're trying to make this cohesive Star Wars universe. They're trying to make sure the games, the movies, the comics, the TV shows, the books, all of the various mediums that Star Wars is in connect to each other and are telling one story.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think this is a bad thing at all. I just don't think it needs to be the only way stories are told. And I don't think stories need to be pitched as, we need to fill this gap or we need to prepare for this era of Star Wars.
Right.
We need to focus on, I want to tell this story that says this thing.
Yep.
And then we find where it goes into the galaxy. Where does it go in the timeline? I don't think it needs to be like, we need to make this story fit in this galaxy, in this timeline, in this era, and have these characters and introduce these pieces of lore, and then do this and then this, and then think about the story.
Yeah.
And I think Leslie Headland is a great storyteller, and I think she is a very good showrunner. I think she struggled with the fact that she is an extra uber fan of Star Wars. Yord is a character that she created in a tabletop RPG session.
Is it really?
Growing up.
Amazing.
So she is a huge Star Wars fan. And I think Star Wars Acolyte understands the lore to an extent that is taking away from the story they want to tell. They are so focused on, we need to introduce this thing in this way so it doesn't impact lore. And I feel like that is the real struggle with Star Wars The Acolyte. And when you look at some great introductions and some great examples of this with the Clone Wars, I also think that there's a lot of Clone Wars that is just as controversial in the way that it's expanding the lore. But because of the amount of time that they're given, they're kind of able to do enough to where you forget about it.
Yeah, that's true.
You don't really care that they change the way that the 501st work.
Yeah.
You don't care about really the addition of Darth Maul again.
Right.
You don't care about the changes to Grievous as a character.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't care about these things because they have 7 seasons of shows to jump back and forth between these various stories in Star Wars.
Yeah.
And also, its focus isn't about that. Its focus is to help add context into how Anakin falls to the dark side.
Right.
Ultimately.
Yeah.
And also make you care about these characters more. And I think that's where a lot of stuff, like I think Mandalorian Season 3 fails with this drastically because they're so focused on how can we set up the next season? How can we bring the characters farther? How can we introduce this piece of the galaxy with this piece of the lore?
Yep.
More so than they are like, let's tell Din Djarin's story. Like, what does it look like for the continuing education of becoming a father to someone whose abilities are foreign to you?
Yeah.
Like, that is the core story of The Mandalorian. It's like trying to give your son, your child, a life that they deserve in a galaxy and world you don't understand.
Not even understand. It's just that you don't fit in.
You kind of like don't have the tools for it.
Yeah, you don't have the tools to do that sort of a thing. Like that's not the role that you ever set yourself up for, and then that's just what the universe gave you. So here you go. I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on what I'm about to say. Do you think Star Wars struggles from too many voices? Like, when I think about like the books and stuff, like these are single writers, I'm assuming.
Yep, they're typically single writers, and typically they're given a lot of leeway.
Right, just
Many of
making
these are
a
kind
story.
of like, hey, make the story.
Right.
It has to connect to here.
Yep.
It has to have this character in it.
Right.
It's kind of like they're given a prompt, really. Some character or like some authors that are just saying, hey, for stuff like the High Republic era, it's like, we need this story. This is the overarching structure.
Right.
We're going to get a bunch of authors together and we're going to flesh out this universe. And then we're going to have like you over here. You're going to make the first book and it's going to be about this thing. And you over here, it's going to be set on this other planet and this other story.
Right. So, and somehow these books get very cohesive but they're also really interesting because of the different takes that there's on specific like instances or characters or whatever. But the TV shows and the movies just seem like they have too many voices in the mix or something. I think that's why Andor did really well because it was just the one director.
It was Tony Gilroy's
doing the thing that
baby.
he wanted to do. He was like, no, I'm saying no to everything else. This is the story I'm going with and I'm doing it. So
it's not like, hey, let's spend more time with these flashbacks to tell this story about how this one group of characters like really fleshed out and make them this thing. It's like, no. When we go to a flashback, it needs to move forward the Andor that we're following.
Right, exactly.
It needs to showcase how he got here and how he is the way he is and why he is the way he is. It's not to flesh out the universe and add like space witches.
Right.
Space witches are cool.
For sure.
But a lot of the story that they're telling with those flashbacks kind of conflict with the characters we're given with Osha and May.
Yeah.
So I think that's where the struggles with those stories are.
Now, you could argue also with what I'm saying about like the too many voices. I mean, Headland was there doing her thing, making that show.
In theory, it's her job to be that person.
But do you think there was more more being thrown at her in that pot?
I think there's more to Headland's story in Star Wars than meets the eye. I feel like a lot of Leslie Headland's struggles with Star Wars The Acolyte is the way that the story is structured and the fact that she wanted to have a show with 4 to 6 seasons. She wanted a story that continued.
Yeah.
Disney/Lucasfilm said, no,
yep.
We're not going to have a continuing story. We're stepping back after this. And while we may have said yes to that continuing story, or a tentative yes of like, yeah, it might go that direction, I think as the production and as the story progressed, it became more and more clear to Leslie and the crew that they were probably not going to get a second season.
Yeah. So
they said, well, screw it. We're going to have to put everything that we set up and we're going to tell over the course of 5 seasons into one.
Whoa.
That's my theory on the structure and the behind the scenes of The Acolyte. I haven't heard anything to confirm or deny this.
Yeah.
I just think from the story that we got and the great nuggets that story has in it, to going flip-flops and like having all these various red herrings and stories that clearly they're like, this could be interesting to follow up on season 3. They're like, but crap, we kind of have to put it in here now. So we hype up the fans so they get on board with us, right. So they help us get another season.
Yeah, I could see that.
That's why Darth Plagueis is there, because they're like, look at this interesting character that you've been wanting to see more of in Star Wars. We're going to put him in at the 12-minute mark of the finale episode that has nothing to do with the story that is being told right now.
Absolutely nothing.
So we can get people hyped to say, what the heck's Darth Plagueis doing there?
Yep.
Why is he just lurking in a cave? Like, clearly, she designed this show to make us all want to know more of the story.
Right.
And didn't focus on, let me make this a cohesive one shot.
Right. I think it still stands, though, that it feels like there was more...
Oh, yeah.
More voices in the creation of it. Like, clearly
Leslie wanted to tell a dark side story,
right.
And this is not a dark side story.
No.
It's the setup for a dark side story.
And it's so jam-packed, again, with stuff to make it need more expansion that it didn't really have a direction.
Yeah. It is bloated.
Yeah.
The story is bloated. They have 7 to 9 different threads that they really want to say stuff with, but they don't have the time to say anything with individual pieces.
Yeah. And if they did say something, it was directly put in the script. Like it was
the characters specifically said the thing that they wanted to tell with the story.
It's like, oh, no, that's not usually what we like to see in a story, but okay, we're good.
Exposition for exposition's sake rather than something that fits the characters. I think that's where one of the other problems with Star Wars Acolyte story. But when we look at like the broader reaches of Star Wars, I think it's going to be very interesting and continue to get very interesting when we see stuff with the movies. The movies have a higher expectation. They're going to be typically safer. But they're also going to have a very limited runtime. So you can't have 7 threads in a movie that's only 2.5 hours.
That's true.
You have to have a cohesive beginning, middle, and an end. You can set up from future movies, like we see with Marvel. Marvel's able to set up for future movies, but also have a contained story, except for like, Infinity War and Endgame, where they're parts 1 and 2.
Right.
But like for the most part, if you look at Civil War, if you look at Winter Soldier, if you look at Iron Man, like if you look at these examples of these stories, you have a beginning, middle, and an end. You have a 3-act structure. Yeah. You have a character growth arc. You can't just say, we're going to have a character growth arc by the 3rd season.
Right.
You can't do that with a movie. You have to have growth in the story by the end of the story. It's the only way it works.
Yeah. I'll be really curious to see what they do with the movies. Hopefully, yes, there is more of that cohesive storytelling piece in each movie. But even in like the sequels, it was a little dicey there.
It was very dicey.
Hopefully, that means that they'll learn from that, and then they'll be more, especially if they're kind of moving away from Disney Plus stuff, and like hounding on these different TV shows and stuff like that. Like, hopefully they'll give it the time, the space that it needs to breathe and do the things. But yeah, I'll be really interested to see if they can kind of get more focused on who's directing these things, who's actually making a story, you know?
Yeah. And they need to stop. And I think they've realized that they made a mistake with the sequel trilogy of this idea that it's a game of telephone of like, or finish the sentence. Let's all get a group of people together and we're going to start with one word and then see where the story goes.
Yeah.
Because that's how the trilogy worked. It's like J.J. Abrams was like, clearly said, I have this thing in mind, and then gave it to Rian Johnson. He's like, actually, I want to tell a story that says something. And then there was a lot of controversy, and then Colin Trevorrow was like, would be really cool. And Disney's like, yeah, we're not going to go with you anymore. We're going to give it to the guy that has said in interviews he doesn't like to end stories. And also have the writer of Paw Patrol on it. So yeah, there's some various things that are controversial with those movies just because they did not have a structure, a story, or an end goal that they wanted to aim for. Mm-hmm. It was just like, you tell a story, you tell a story, you tell a story. And make them connect, I guess. But whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, the end goal on the sequels was very convoluted. Oh, I don't think that's where they were going anyway. Like, it felt like they decided that at the third movie where it was like, no, this is how we're going to end it. Okay.
Yeah. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a mortal wound.
Yeah.
But I think there's like so much potential for these stories. I do hope that they correct in a way that is conducive to storytelling, conducive to addition of lore, but strikes a balance that is necessary. Like storytelling that strikes a balance. So storytelling first, lore second. Make it work within the lore, but if you kind of have to adjust things, I'm perfectly fine with them adjusting it. Mm-hmm. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Would be very interested to see what you think on this. Let us know in the comments or contact uplinkpodcast.com if you're listening to this wherever you find podcasts. As always, thanks for listening, and may the Force be with you.